Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is you happen to be. Hey, everybody, I hope you're having a great week and that everything's going really well. Today, we're going to be talking about what historians call new immigration. Now, in order to understand new immigration, we have to have some context. Old immigration was or is a term referring to a wave of immigrants who came into the United States during the 19th century, specifically during like the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 1850s. And specifically, it's referring to groups of people who came from Western Europe. These immigrants tended to be, as far as skin pigmentation was concerned, they tended to be white. They tended to speak English. They tended to be more well educated. And although many were Irish Catholics, many were Protestant in their religion. And so generally speaking, they tended to have more Western style characteristics. New immigration, by contrast, would be punctuated by people from Russia, Italy. You'd see a number of Japanese who would come in. These were folks from Southern and Eastern Europe who were not pigmentally white, who did not speak English, many of whom were unskilled laborers, many of whom were illiterate or uneducated, many of whom were not Christians. You had a number of Jews, for example, who came during this wave of new immigration. And essentially, new immigrants were different from Western Europeans who tended to be, and I mean Western Europeans, old immigrants tended to be more like Americans from an outward point of view. And so what happens during the new wave of immigration is many Americans, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and many of them were middle-class Americans, urban middle-class Americans. They grew to be very fearful of this new wave of immigration, and there was a major move towards restricting the flow of immigration. And in fact, there's going to be a number of different laws that will be passed in order to deal with what some people refer to as the hordes of immigrants, streaming into the United States. Now, I'm going to read to you from a book called America, A Narrative History. George Tyndall writes the following. He says, America's roaring prosperity and promise of political and religious freedom attracted waves of immigrants from every part of the globe after the Civil War. By 1900, nearly 30% of city residents were foreign-born. And the majority of immigrants who came into the United States, and they generally came through two areas. One would have been Ellis Island, located in New Jersey, and then folks would go through Ellis Island, and then they would basically get dropped off in New York. The other group would be predominantly Japanese and Chinese, although I will say the tide of Chinese immigrants did slow to a certain extent because of the Chinese Exclusion Act that was put into place in 1882. But if you were from Asia, you would have come through Angel Island, and Angel Island was a processing center located in San Francisco. This is why, for example, if you go to San Francisco today, you still will see a very significant Chinatown. There was and still is a significant influence of Japanese culture and heritage in Northern California, as well as in Oregon and in Washington. And so just recognize that these were the two areas where you would come through. But most immigrants, once they got through these processing centers, they would remain in the cities where they found themselves. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that they simply had no more money with which to move forward. But cities also offered immigrants an opportunity to create ethnic communities which could shield them from the prejudicial pressures and other pressures that they would encounter. When you have Little Italy or Chinatown or Little Tokyo, or what have you, right? These kind of ethnic enclaves, ethnic communities provide a sense of community for folks who oftentimes don't speak the language and are really finding themselves in a foreign land. He goes on to state, most of these newcomers were desperately poor people eager to pursue the American dream. They brought with them a distinctive work ethic. Working only to survive is often wretched. Working for a better life for oneself and one's children and grandchildren gives labor a fierce dignity. That dignity, infused with an optimistic energy and aspiration, endowed the new immigrants with resilience and determination. In providing much-needed labor for the growing economy, however, the influx of immigrants also sparked racial and ethnic tensions. Indeed, there is an industrial revolution going on in the United States at this time, and immigrants are going to come to fulfill those jobs. But the problem with this is that, and it's not really so much an actual problem as it is a perceived problem, as these immigrants begin to come in waves into the United States, and they are coming in large numbers, native-born Americans, and I don't mean Native Americans, I mean white native-born Americans, they began to drum up fears that were not new in American history, but they are fears rooted in nativism. That is a strong and intense fear of immigrants. And they began to make arguments that immigrants were dangerous to the United States, particularly for Asian and Japanese immigrants. It was noted that they were unassimilable. They couldn't come into the United States and become like good Americans. The mayor of San Francisco once stated, and his name was James D. Phelan, he once stated that the Japanese were not bona fide citizens, that they weren't made up of the thing that good Americans were made up of, and he campaigned on a Keep California, Keep America White campaign, and it was very successful in the time he was reelected. But one of the things that's interesting about these immigrants is that oftentimes, folks thought that immigrants should be Americanized, that they should be acculturated, assimilated into American society. And the process of assimilating immigrants has never really worked out well. We have this very erroneous perception in the United States that we are a melting pot. A melting pot is basically this idea that we have all of these people groups and they all come together. You know, you've got Jews on one hand, you've got Italians over here, you got the Japanese, you got the Chinese, you've got Poles, you've got the English, the Dutch, the Germans, whatever. They all are different, but then ultimately what they do is they all blend together to create one type of culture so that you can no longer identify or distinguish the various parts that came together. The United States has never been a melting pot. The continued presence of these ethnic communities indicates that that's just not the case. The other issue with assimilation is that it is racial on its face, in the sense that when we ask immigrants to assimilate, what we're really saying is that the culture that you are coming from is not as good as the one that's in the United States. And so what you need to do is to shove off this old identity and adopt a new one. And of course, that didn't always happen either. But there is this definite move against immigrants. In fact, one of the interesting results or consequences that comes from nativism and fear of these new immigrants is the new immigration law, which came out, I believe, first in 1821, then again in 1824. But there was in 1824 an immigration law that was passed, which established quotas, which, of course, if you're not familiar with what a quota is, it means there's only a certain number of people that we will allow in from any particular country. Now, that might not sound so bad, but what's interesting about the quota system of 1824 is that the legislature that created the Immigration Act of 1824, they based the quota on census data that came from 1890. And that is a bit funny because it's 1824 when the law is being written. You would think that they would then base their quotas off of the 1820 census. But the reason why they didn't do that is because in 1890, there were more desirable immigrants coming into the United States. That is, in 1890, you had more German, you had more Western European immigrants coming in than you did Southeast Europeans. By 1820, that number has begun to shift. There's more Southeast Europeans coming in. So what you do is you establish a quota based upon 1890, which I believe it was 2%. And therefore, what that means is that you're going to really limit the number of undesirable immigrants, and you're going to allow more of the desirable immigrants. It is a deeply problematic law that stayed into existence up until the 1960s, when it was eventually changed. As I understand it, by the way, I don't believe Mexico was affected by the quota system of 1824. That would change in the 1960s, however. Tyndall goes on to write the following. The traditional pattern of immigration changed, however, as the proportion of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, especially Russia, Poland, Greece, and Italy, rose during the last quarter of the 19th century. After 1890, these quote-unquote new immigrants made up a majority of arrivals. Their languages and cultural backgrounds were markedly different from those of previous immigrants or of most native-born Americans. The dominant religions of the new immigrants, for example, were Judaism, Eastern Orthodox, and Roman Catholicism, whereas Protestants still formed a large majority of the U.S. population. And of course, they ended up in a number of cities. Now, the experiences of these various disparate people are varied, but there's a lot of similarity to them. The group that I am more personally interested in would be the Japanese and their experiences. The Japanese actually began to emigrate to the United States during the latter part of the 19th century due to major changes that took place in Japan, which we don't necessarily need to get into, but just understand that there was kind of a regime change. The Tokugawa shogunate sort of disappeared. There was a restoration of the emperor, and there came a moment in Japanese history where Japan tried to modernize and westernize. And so some of the earliest immigrants to the United States from Japan were coming to the country in order to learn Western institutions so that they could go back and help facilitate this westward development, or this Western development in Japan. But the Japanese who came to the United States, they are going to be industrious individuals. They oftentimes came to places like California, and they came through Hawaii, was normally where you would see them come through. There was a lot of farming that took place on Hawaii, and Japanese sort of went through there and came to California and Oregon and Idaho. But the thing that the Japanese did that was different from the Chinese who came before is the Japanese had a propensity to work in community. And I don't necessarily mean that the Chinese didn't have community, but the Japanese were not really content just being contract laborers. They wanted to own land, and so they began to sort of pool their resources. And their experience in California is deeply troubling. There was a lot of racial animosity against the Japanese. Once the Japanese in California, for example, started to do well and they started to have economic success, and they did so by growing their own crops, largely strawberries, for example. They began to own their own land. And when that began to happen, white American nativists began to become very fearful of the Japanese. And so they began to pass laws like the Alien Land Law of 1913, which basically restricted anybody who could not get citizenship from owning land. And just so you're aware, according to the United States law, Chinese and Japanese could not gain citizenship, even if they had wanted to. They were barred. So they were forever perpetual foreigners, except for their children. If you were a Japanese immigrant family and you came to the United States and you had a child here, then that child would be an American citizen. But there was a lot of racial animosity against the Japanese, as well as other groups. But their experiences are unique, obviously because of where they live. But there definitely is a growing fear of immigrants throughout the United States. And you'll be able to see more of that as we go through the content for this week. We'll mention this later on in a different lecture, but the plight of immigrants, particularly in New York, was especially horrifying. Many immigrants ended up living in tenement-style housing. Tenements are basically hastily constructed buildings, oftentimes with no real easy ventilation, no light, no plumbing. And they would cram as many people into these houses as they possibly could. And it was a situation where people would basically die in these homes because of poor sanitation. We'll talk about this group of people. Jacob Riis, who was a muckraker. He was a Dutch immigrant to the United States. I believe he was Dutch. He came, he got a job in the police department, and he began to go around to these tenements, and he began to talk about their plight and their condition. And he wrote a book called How the Other Half Live. Because during this time of immigration expansion, there is a lot of industrial development going on, and there are a handful of people who are making bank. You think of people like Rockefeller and Carnegie, and they just have millions and millions of dollars to their name. And yet the stark contrast between the Rockefellers and the other half is remarkable. But we'll talk about these folks. So I could go on and on about this. If you're really interested in the history of immigration, I would encourage you to read a book by Paul Spickard called Almost All Aliens. It's a really thick book. It's very lengthy, but it's one of the best that I've read on this topic. So if this is a topic that you're interested in, this is just scratching the surface today. So that's what we got. If you have any questions or comments, please contact me. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled, may the force be with you, live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.